Okay, we want to understand this distinction between primary and secondary properties because it's really essential to understanding Locke and the empiricists. It seems like we're making this little picky, petty distinction. What on earth's significance does it have? Who cares? What's the difference between primary and secondary properties? But it's this distinction that enables Berkeley to claim that there is no such thing as a material world. It's this distinction that leads in part to Hume's skeptical claims. But it's also this distinction that Locke relies on because to claim that we do live in a real material world with real objects in it that exist whether we're here or not to experience them. In other words, both for Descartes and Locke, for Descartes at the end, when he deals with the skeptical arguments, there's no problem in claiming that these chairs and desks that you're sitting on were here in this room over the weekend when nobody was around to experience them, and that these are the same desks that were there on Friday. So Locke says the ideas we get from things external to us are of either primary or secondary properties, and we looked at his claim last time that for Locke, not all of the properties that we seem to experience as things having in the real world are properties which really are in things in the real world. For Locke, the secondary properties are added by our mind. They're caused. The experience of them is caused by the motion of molecules in space, and they're caused by the primary properties of things in matter, but these are subjective and mind dependent. And we saw that they include things like colors, tastes, smells, feelings of heat and cold, sounds. One of my longest standing friends in the backgammon club was somebody I've known off and on since the 70s, and I get a ride down occasionally to a tournament, Sunday afternoon tournament in Vienna, Virginia, right? But he is deaf. Can't hear a thing. If he drifts over in the lane a little bit, he's got this really new Prius. They're a very nice car. When people honk the horn, he can't hear it. Sometimes he'll leave a blinker on, even if I point to it, and he can't hear the click, 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 click of the turn signal being on, but it drives the rest of us nuts when somebody leaves a turn signal on in the car, right? So the world as he experiences it is different from the world as I experience it as somebody who has hearing. So sounds are secondary properties, and are subjective to people. But we saw that feelings of heat and cold, that warmth and cold are not properties in things for Locke as they are in the world. And we saw his argument to this effect where the middle bucket here, if you weren't here last time, has lukewarm or room temperature water. the one on your left has hot water, the one on your right has cold. And we saw that if you were conditioning both hands to opposite temperature waters, right? You take the hand out of the hot water and put it in the room temperature water, and that water is going to feel cold to the touch because it's just been in the hot water. But you'll have the opposite experience with the hand that was in the ice water. You take that out of the ice water, put it in the room temperature water, that water's going to feel warm, even hot. So you say, wait a second, the same water can't have two opposite properties of being hot and cold at the same time. So how do we get out of the contradiction? Well, Locke says the way we get out of the contradiction is to say that heat and cold are not properties of the water, but they're in them only as subjective feelings caused by the water in us. So we have to either conclude then that the same water is both hot and cold, and he says we don't want to conclude that a contradiction is true. So we conclude the alternative, and that's that heat and cold aren't in the water as properties, but are in the mind. And we saw with color perceptions, it's that way for Locke. I talked about my dad being colorblind. I'm not, and here I'm talking about colorblind in the most literal, technical sense of the term, not in the metaphorical, sense that people talk about when we're talking about race relations. I am not colorblind in the technical sense. I can see colors fine, thank you very much. So presumably the subjective experience I had in coming up to a traffic light, and have to this day, was different from the experience my father would have had since he was colorblind. So Locke says the secondary properties aren't really in things, but for Locke there's a real world that exists whether we're around or not. And what he refers to as primary properties, those really are properties of things as they are in the world. They include things like the size of something, its shape, molecular texture. He thought that it's the molecules. Remember, he knew about the atomic theory and molecules. He was a direct friend of Newton and Boyle. And knew that molecules cause our experiences of secondary properties like colors and feelings of warmth and cold. So we have about almost 10 minutes. So here's essentially what Locke says about the primary properties. That our ideas of them do genuinely resemble them as they are in real external objects, so that those ideas accurately convey knowledge of them to us. In other words, on Locke's view, how do I know that hanging on that wall is a rectangular whiteboard of a certain size? Well, remember, for Locke, we're in the egocentric predicament. The mind is never acquainted with anything directly outside itself. It is only acquainted with its own ideas. Remember, for Locke, ideas are a technical term, or ideas a technical term, and ideas are the immediate objects of our experience, of our perception. So I never, for Locke, perceive an object directly in the external world. What I perceive are my own internal ideas that relate to that object. But Locke says, I've got an internal image that tells me that there is a whiteboard on the wall that is rectangular in shape. Remember, shape, whether it's circular, rectangular, spherical, triangular shapes, excuse me, are primary properties of objects as they are in the world. And so it's like we know things in the external world through subjective pictures we have of them that are conveyed. And now we're not talking about the inverted image on the back of the retina. They knew about that, by the way. But here we're talking about an immaterial image in the immaterial mental space of our minds. But nonetheless, he says our ideas of primary qualities really resemble them. That is, the internal picture I have of the whiteboard accurately conveys to me the knowledge that it is rectangular, because my own subjective idea of the whiteboard as being rectangular resembles the actual shape of the whiteboard as it is in the real world. Plus, I have an idea of the size of the whiteboard. Locke says our senses accurately convey to us information regarding the size of things. Size is another primary property for Locke. But now, again, that board is white with silver or aluminum colored, border around the edges. Those colors, again, are subjective and in us. There's nothing in my experience that resembles something that's actually in the whiteboard regarding color. So there's a difference between appearance and reality. Our subjective experience of the world is of a world with both primary and secondary properties, but for Locke, the world as it is contains only secondary properties. And yet the senses, contains only primary properties, not secondary. But our senses for Locke really convey reliable knowledge of the external world because we have subjective mental pictures that accurately resemble things as they are in the real world in terms of size and shape and color and hardness. And these are and the capability of motion in space. So for Locke then, and this is a very important slide to look at, and it's the last one because I ended here with a 10 o'clock class, and it's a good one to transition. If you want to understand Berkeley and Hume, understand what this slide says. An object out there in the world, like an old-fashioned telephone, for us is just a combination of its primary and secondary properties. But for Locke, some of the properties of this telephone are subjective and in us, like its color, the sound of its ring. Whereas other, the cool feel of it to the touch, those are subjective, those are secondary properties. But for Locke, the size of the telephone, its shape, its number, that it's one telephone and not two or three, all of these are properties of the telephone in the real world. Now, if you understand that, you'll be on board with how Berkeley tries to convince us that all of the beliefs we've had since childhood that we're in a real material world are false. There is no such thing as matter existing independently of its being perceived. for George Barkley. Okay, so again, hopefully everybody sees how to figure out what grade they got on the test. If you have any questions, just come up to me. And please bring the roll up. And thanks very much. We'll see you Wednesday, and we'll try to